Due to the subject matter of this video and reference to said German party and Mustache Man, there's a possibility that YouTube will definitely restrict this video. So I recommend you guys to share this video so that we can counteract YouTube's censorship of history and libertarian or conservative content. Left-wingers subversively claim to stand for human liberties. They assert that leftism is the direct opposition towards authoritarianism. Yet in reality, those on the left advocate for the same totalitarian motives or tactics as the likes of fascist regimes and Islamic caliphates. A great instance of this is the stance among the radical left in regards to free speech. Most of you are probably thinking of cancel culture, however my discussion is more concerned about left-wing extremists wanting to disregard the First Amendment entirely. Whether that be cracking down against quote-unquote misinformation, or punishing hate speech and wrong thinking. And there are those who justify their desire in abolishing free speech by claiming that doing so will prevent authoritarian groups, specifically the intolerant kind, from getting public traction and establishing a totalitarian state. A proponent of this assertion is Marxist YouTuber Tovarishch Endymion, who argues that the concept of free speech is a complete myth, which he tries to prove with a simple yet condescending paradox. Despite the video being made in 2018, Endymion's point continues to bug me in the back of my mind for so long that it deserves a rebuttal. Now, he first argues that nobody actually believes in free speech, claiming that allowing free speech would eventually lead to the demise of free speech.
Nobody is actually in favor of freedom of speech. If you think you are, you're lying to yourself. Nobody wants complete freedom of speech. There's a bit of a paradox to demonstrate this. Let's say that a growing Nazi movement is gaining ground. The only way to stop it is to suppress the party, suppress their speech, for merely doing nothing but organizing and saying stuff. Now, if you do this, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. But if you don't do this, let's assume that they gain a hold of the political system, a hold of the social system, and themselves suppress freedom of speech. So if you don't act, then you're not in favor of freedom of speech, because freedom of speech will be destroyed. But if you do act, you're not in favor of freedom of speech either, because freedom of speech will also be destroyed.
His argument stems from the paradox of tolerance deriving from Karl Popper, the philosopher responsible for conscribing the concept of an open society and being the guy who inspired George Soros. Endymion even cites Popper himself.
Now, something like this was proposed by Karl Popper, the paradox of tolerance. If you are fully and totally tolerant, then you're tolerant of intolerance. But intolerance will not be tolerant of you. So, to be truly tolerant, you have to be intolerant. Otherwise, you're not in favor of tolerance to begin with. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? The answer is no. It's a paradox, but unlimited tolerance can lead to the extinction of tolerance. When we extend tolerance to those who are openly intolerant, the tolerant ones end up being destroyed, and tolerance with them. So tolerance requires intolerance.
If Endymion actually researched Karl Popper, he would have realized that Popper isn't talking about censoring the intolerant or suppressing intolerant speech. In fact, his argument that intolerance against intolerance should only be necessary when defending tolerance from violence and suppression. Here's a quote from Karl Popper in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies as long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion. Suppression would certainly be unwise, but we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists and pistols. We should therefore claim the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. To summarize, Popper proposed using the free market of ideas through free speech and expression to counter intolerant ideas, and that we should only respond with intolerance when the intolerant refuse to engage with rational argument and instead resort to violence and aggression to suppress the rights of others. Everyone who believes in the principle of free speech actually agrees with Popper's stance on tolerance, as we never claim that tolerance extends to violence. It is Endymion who is in conflict with the so-called paradox, since he is the one who is in favor of the tactics that Popper warned about. I want to bring up how Endymion rephrases Popper's paradox into a scenario in which there's a rising fascist movement that is gaining more and more popular support every day, and the only way to stop these evil Nazis from taking power is by repressing their rights of free speech. Endymion even cites Nazi Germany as an example of what free speech can lead to. It isn't surprising that Endymion would allude to Nazis this way, since Marxists are infamous for subversively referencing fascists as faceless boogeymen to demonize people or concepts that they oppose, especially when those people or concepts have nothing to do with National Socialism or fascism. To claim that tolerance to free speech is what enabled the likes of Hitler to obtain dictatorial powers is a complete oversimplification of history. Granted, Hitler was a great speaker, and I'm not denying that his speaking talent had a big impact in becoming Führer. However, assuming that speaking in a podium was the core of the Nazi takeover of Germany is negating the role of violence that enabled the National Socialist Party to intimidate the political process in Hitler's favor. Before 1933, the Nazis were only able to win less than 40% in the elections, with Hitler getting 36% of the votes in the presidential election, and the Nazis winning 37% of the parliamentary seats in the federal election. However, the German state at the time was unstable, as elections failed to establish a majority government during a time of chaos resulting from the economic crisis of the Great Depression and constant violent attacks and terrorism coming from the far left and the far right extremists, including the Nazis who engaged in intimidation and assaulting their enemies. And although the state somewhat retaliated to their actions, the disorganized and weak state of the government weakens the ability to maintain order within the country. With there being no majority government in 1933, German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. And to quickly summarize so that this video wouldn't be a history lecture, after the Reichstag fire, which may or may not had been done by the Nazis, the cabinet decreed an enabling and emergency constitutional powers, which placed constraints on the press and party's activities. In addition, a snap election was called, where the National Socialist Party won 44%, achieving a majority coalition in parliament, though this is due in part to the Nazis violently intimidating opposition parties. With a new majority coalition, Parliament passes the Enabling Act, which grants the Chancellor supreme legislative powers, which in turn installed Hitler as German dictator. To emphasize my point, political violence and an unstable government are what allowed the intolerant to overthrow the Weimar Republic, not free speech. Of course, there is the possibility that the intolerant use of speech and expression can lead to intolerant people and ideas getting power in government. However, I argue that suppressing speech isn't the solution. Rather, we should combat intolerance by having a government with checks and balances to ensure that such ruthless ideologies won't have a full range in suppressing individual rights. This fits his next argument that all civilizations are bound with certain ideals, and for society to function, it must preserve those ideals even if that entails defending them from parties or individuals who wish to repeal those ideals.
And this is clear by how societies are set up. Societies have a common binding feature, a common ideals, which they base themselves on. Now, since these ideals are proposing something, there is going to be a set of ideals which negate that. This is the dialectic. Society has a thesis, it proposes something, and then there is something against that, the antithesis. Now, one principle which is common in all societies is preservation. Whether it's socialist, capitalist, monarchist, they are all in favor of preserving their system. Yet this idea of preservation necessarily conflicts with the opposite ideals. How do you handle an antagonistic contradiction? For example, within liberal democracy, fascism might be the antagonistic contradiction, radical monarchism, revolutionary socialism. Those are all antagonistic contradictions to liberal democracy. So, liberal democracy must wish to preserve itself, therefore it must handle these antagonistic contradictions. And the only way to handle them is through violence, through suppression of speech. Otherwise, the antagonistic contradiction will overtake the society and change it, which will create yet more contradictions.
For a liberal society to resort to censorship and punishing speech to preserve liberal ethics would require abandoning one of its binding ideals, that being free speech and expression. I think what Endymion is going for with this point is to suggest that liberalism is an oxymoron, and of course, this is referring to the general ethics and principles of America's political system, not the form of liberalism that Republicans associate with hardcore progressives. The flaw of this thesis is that liberal democracies that were set up with the goals of protecting individual liberties have built-in systems for the purpose of upholding liberalism from infiltration. A case in point is the US system of checks and balances. The Supreme Court of the United States is responsible for safeguarding and interpreting the Constitution, with such abilities that include vetoing executive orders or laws that are deemed to violate the Constitution and ensuring the American people the promise of equal justice under the law. There's also the separation of the three branches of government, that being legislative, executive, and judicial, which through this separation, it hinders each branch of the state from controlling too much power. And let's not forget the Electoral College, which protects smaller and less populated states from being overly represented by larger and more populated states. All of what I just said is elementary civics 101, yet Stalin bootlicker Endymion never takes this into account in his argument. He, however, does bring up cherry-picked instances in American history in which the government instituted laws that suppressed First Amendment rights which, although bad, were poorly enforced and were overturned shortly after being enacted. In particular, the Sedition Act of 1798 and the Palmer Raids that occurred between 1919 and 1920. The Sedition Act, within its 2 years of existence, only 25 people were arrested and an additional 10 were convicted. This small number was due to the fact that several states, including Virginia and Kentucky, passed laws that banned the enforcement of the Sedition Act within their state. And it was so unpopular that it cost John Adams his re-election against Thomas Jefferson, who ran on a platform of repealing the act, which led to the Alien Sedition Act demise in 1800 and Jefferson pardoning everyone who had been convicted under the act. The Palmer Raids, although many of their practices violated individual rights, did not suppress free speech, but rather arrested and deported suspected communists and anarchists, who the mass majority of them weren't even American citizens, over the conviction of members of terrorist organizations and labor unions that had ties to the Soviets. The term Palmer Raids, in fact, derives from a terrorist bombing of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's house, which sparked a federal investigation against suspected terrorists, specifically those related to communism. Now granted, there were a lot of things that were uncalled for, especially when the newly formed Bureau of Investigation relied on flimsy evidence, along with illegal searches, beating up and threatening suspects during questioning, and a lot of the investigations were fueled by xenophobia towards Russian immigrants, since some of these quote-unquote terrorist groups were labor unions that were led by immigrants with no evidence of any connection to the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks, but were suspected of being quote-unquote agents spreading Bolshevism, with the only reason being that these union workers were simply Russians. However, it should be noted that there's a difference between expressing your opinion of overthrowing the US government and joining a domestic terrorist group. Saying, for instance, that America deserved 9/11 is not the same as joining a jihadist terrorist organization, since associating with terrorists is by default taking part in violence. Now, I will admit that the United States has in the past implemented measures that violated the First Amendment, a case in point being Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, which Endymion does mention in his video. Despite being done to protect rail lines from sabotage and preventing riots, it unethically exceeded to the point of censoring newspapers and arresting Confederate sympathizers on the basis of their opinions. However, I do not condone such actions, and in my opinion, the Union's suppression of free speech was wrong, and so do everyone who wished to uphold the First Amendment. Endymion, on the other hand, only expressed these instances of American censorship as a form of lousy whataboutism to advocate for the deplatforming and censoring of political influencers that he deems to be fascist, one of them being, not joking here, Milo Yiannopoulos.
So people like, Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer, if they were in power, if they influenced and spoke to a degree where they had significant influence, do you really think they would be interested in freedom of speech for everyone? For people that they dislike, for the left, for even the moderate left that disagree with their ideals, would they really respect them? Would they really not suppress them?
Referencing Milo as someone in which Americans should be worried about obtaining power is ridiculous, and lumping him with the likes of Richard Spencer is outright absurd. For starters, Milo Yiannopoulos is nowhere near the authoritarian right of the political spectrum. Milo is a gay, neoconservative Trump supporter whose main political attribute is advocating and defending the free market of ideas from cancel culture and social media censorship. Endymion could argue that Milo is just being subversive, that he is an undercover Nazi, a wolf in sheep's clothing, waiting for the opportunity to establish a Fourth Reich in the United States. Even if that was true, he is not an American citizen, and even if he becomes one, Milo wouldn't meet the qualifications to run for president since he was born in England. In regards to Richard Spencer, he definitely fits the category of a fascist or at least an authoritarian white supremacist. But even then, there's no necessary reason to censor and arrest him due to the fact that Richard Spencer is a grifter with a declining following. Now, this may sound contradictory as grifting tends to increase one's popularity. However, there's a hard line in grifting, and going too far would cost any politician their followers. Richard Spencer is a clear example of the consequences of extreme grifting. Spencer may have gotten his large popularity by grifting to Ron Paul libertarians, and then grifting to Trump-supporting Republicans, and then grifting to white nationalism. However, when Spencer began grifting to communist Tankies, and then later Democrats by endorsing Biden, is when we see a decline of his popularity. He is no longer perceived by his followers as the white knight who would overthrow the globalist establishment, but rather a political shifting clown, or that CNN political commentator. In conclusion, although the video tries to take the stance on defending tolerance, in reality, all it did was present Endymion as an authoritarian commie who is as intolerant as those pesky Nazis. This reminds me of the infamous Horseshoe Theory, a political concept that centers on the claim that the further politically left or right you go in the political compass, the more and more the extremes of both sides will begin to resemble each other. I am not saying that I fully agree with this perspective as someone who isn't that keen in categorizing beliefs as being left-wing or right-wing, especially when fascism isn't really right-wing but rather categorizes itself as being third-positionist or existing outside the political compass. But I will say that there are aspects in which Marxism and fascism do resemble each other. Both ideologies are built upon utopianism. Both fascism and Marxist-Leninism center on establishing a totalitarian state that would interfere in the personal lives of its subjects to formulate an equal society. And of course, both of these political philosophies had resulted in countless human rights abuses and genocides that had killed millions. Finally, these two political philosophies share the same flaw, that being the abolition of free speech and expression that is crucial for a prosperous society. Anyway, please like and share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. Oh, and remember that all commies are bad.